Okay, we're walking in the woods again and getting rained on a little bit today. I don't think it's going to get too bad, so we'll just go ahead and hit record, and hopefully we stay dry enough to keep the conversation going.
We are getting bothered by the mosquitoes, though. So
yeah, hopefully we do stay dry enough, because we're far enough away from home that if we start getting poured on, we're going to be poured on for a long ways. Anyways, today we're going to talk a little bit, hopefully, about the mark of the beast in Revelation. And with, I'll just say briefly, totalizing systems that try to categorize everything, the sin of not of rational thought, but of the kind of rational pride. But that's all kind of coming up later. First, we wanted to just kick it off with a little discussion of the book of Revelation generally, more broadly, and how is it that we approach the book of Revelation. And David, you were just, here comes that rain. You were just talking about different ways that people view Revelation, and you're saying some of these just seem like they're not that useful to living a good Christian life.
Yeah.
So what do you have in mind?
I don't really want to go too far, like bring up here's this view of Revelations, here's that view of Revelations, and take like the combative approach to some other approach. But, like we had this conversation privately a few nights ago where, like, being younger and being exposed to these kind of hardcore interpretations of Revelations, and here's how this is going to happen, and here's how this is the end of the world, and here's how we interpret all these things, so on and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think our dad said that the dispensationalists have all the best charts. And
right.
It's specifically, talking about like charts of how the events in Revelation will unfold in history. Go on.
Yeah, so on. Just kind of just general things like that. I guess I was hesitating from specifically mentioning like dispensationalists or millennialists or any of these different groups.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trying to call out some specific person and say you're full of baloney and here's why. Instead, what I'm trying to do is present an alternative that I guess, like for me personally, like takes Revelations from this standpoint where it's like this really heavy and dark and cryptic and oppressive thing that I really don't like reading it, and I'd rather not talk about it.
Okay, and just to make sure like we're capturing it, it's not dark because it's got like images of dragons and the flaming sword coming out of Christ's mouth and these like kind of horror sort of images. That's not the kind of darkness you mean. You mean like the darkness of rational theology, essentially. Like you've got everything has its particular place, and if you sit down and you kind of read through this, then it feels like reality is an oppressive machine.
Yeah, right. I guess that's a good way of putting it. I hadn't quite thought of it in that way exactly. But anyway, like moving it from that kind of perspective, where if I have that perspective, I really dislike Revelations and I'd rather not read it or talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
To where now if I look at it in sort of this different way, like we're not going to go too far into detail, like we said, we're actually talking about the mark of the beast specifically and the number of the beast, where like suddenly like I understand Revelations in such a way that like what I see it as not so much this like charted out description of the end of the world, but like the whole of Scripture contained in a single narrative, and like the whole of Christianity summarized and like presented in this perfect form.
Mm-hmm.
And like you suddenly like you see unfolding in Revelations, like I guess you could say through your spiritual eyes, just like this perfect form of Christianity. And so where suddenly it's like, wow, this is an amazing book and I really like it.
Yeah.
And I want to read it.
Right. Now I want to quick before we leave, I guess the complaining. Not that I'm going to be doing any complaining against specific groups or anything, but when I was working in the Dominican Republic, I was working all with Americans who were all speaking English. It wasn't really that exotic of an experience that I'm describing here, but we were going to have a chapel service. Now there was this guy who worked at the school that I was a part of, who was he had a master's degree in history, and was kind of like the local scholar. I mean, this was a boarding school for troubled teenagers, so it wasn't really the place that attracts scholars. I'm not criticizing it by saying that, but it's a different kind of person that's drawn to it. So this guy was sort of the scholar in residence, I guess. And he wanted to do a service, and I think, I could have my facts wrong, and it'll be really easy to look this up for anybody who's listening. I think that this was the Saturday before Easter, and that I might be mistaken about, but it was a practice in Coptic Christianity that leading up to Easter, you have a church service where you just read the book of Revelation, and then there's some music that goes along with it, but there's no preaching of any kind, there's no interpretation whatsoever. You just read the book of Revelation from beginning to end. And when I heard of his plan to do this, I mentioned the whole story just to describe this moment. Like, there's this sort of like churning in my gut, like something made me uncomfortable about the idea of reading Revelation with a group of people. And the thing that made me uncomfortable is exactly what you're describing, this sort of like dark system of interpretation. And when you sit down and you read it, you sort of feel like this burden that you are supposed to subscribe to one or another system of interpretation. And then you have this sort of rational task of every time these images come up in the book, then you're supposed to figure out what is the meaning of the image. And so, like, the whole thing sounded like something I was not going to enjoy, and I really did enjoy it. I was quite surprised, like, to actually just read the book and to not worry about any preaching, not worry about any interpretation, not worry about any system whatsoever, but just to see the images, like, be exposed to them,
right?
And to feel them. It was just something that I took to be a very positive experience. It's hard for me to explain what I gained from it from an intellectual standpoint, but I guess one thing would be a greater interpretation of the book itself, which is something.
Yeah, and I guess it gets into the point. So, like, we lay like this systematic approach over Revelation, which is really something we do to the whole of Scripture. It's kind of the subject we had in our last, I guess it'll be 3 episodes. Is that right? When we were talking about our approach to Scripture, it's sort of the same thing. That, like, you lay like this rigid framework over things and like funnel everything through it. Mm-hmm. And I guess, like, sort of the point we're going to make, and this will make more sense as we go on, that what maybe what you're actually doing, or maybe what I'm actually doing, I don't want to sound accusatory in my language again, like, maybe what I'm actually doing when I take that kind of a view on Scripture and I fall back into that sort of pattern is I am actually I guess, how do I want to say this? I'm actually placing on myself the mark of the beast. I'm actually embracing that. And that's something that maybe sounds like total nonsense, but I think hopefully it'll make more sense as we go into this conversation.
Yeah, and I'll just put this idea of the totalizing system out there when you say, like, because we'll associate totalizing system with the mark of the beast, and I don't want to get into that conversation just yet, but you're saying that I'm coming to this text and I'm putting a totalizing system on it.
Right.
I guess I also want to mention with the book of Revelation, it's a book that has been extremely important. I like you, I don't want to attack different ways of interpreting it, because I think that basically, like in any system of interpretation of Revelation, there probably is an element of truth in it, like according to our own perspective. And the some interpretations are maybe trickier for us than others, I guess, to fit into the way that we look at it. But for the most part, we can look at something and say, like, well, is this all just a description of Rome? Then we can say, yeah, that works. That's a description of Rome. And then we can look and we can say, well, is it instead a description of what happens within the individual spirit? Then we can look at it and say, yeah, that works. It's an interpretation of what happens in the individual spirit. Could it be describing the Catholic Church? Like the way that the Reformers looked at it. Yeah, it could be describing that. We're going to approach this thing as the symbols in this book as being part of a pattern.
Right. And like, if you want to categorize, like, first of all, like, I don't like categorizing things. And like, that'll make more sense as we go on. Because, like, you know, on the one hand, I do like categorizing things because it's very useful. But on the other hand, like, forcing everything into categories is actually a very bad thing in a lot of cases. But like, if we were going to categorize this, maybe you could say, on the one hand, you have a closed interpretation of things. This is this. This is talking about this. Right. And then on the other hand, you have an open interpretation of things.
Yeah, that's good. Because a closed interpretation means, like, if you've set your boundaries for your closed interpretation too tight, then what your interpretation is doing is it's cutting off all kinds of truth. It's cutting off more truth than it's including.
Right. Yeah, so like, tying this back to the mark of the beast, so like, Christianity goes crazy in identifying the mark of the beast. Like, say, like, this is the mark of the beast. Barcodes are the mark of the beast. Microchips are the mark of the beast.
Vaccines.
Cell phones, vaccines, yeah.
Which include microchips, apparently.
Right. All of these things, this is the mark of the beast, and if you take these things, like, you're taking on yourself the mark of the beast. And, like, I'm tempted to have a response to that, like, no, you're all crazy. These things aren't the mark of the beast. Like, when the mark of the beast, like, sometimes I almost have this idea, like, when the mark of the beast comes along, like, you'll know it. But, like, actually, I think that's the opposite of true. I think, like, actually, you're all right in that these things maybe not necessarily are the mark of the beast, but are certainly connected to the mark of the beast. And yeah, I guess, again, like, this is something that hopefully will unfold in, like, its meaning will unfold and open up to you as we go forward.
Okay. Yeah, I still am not ready to quite get into the mark of the beast. I mean,
right.
So I'm gonna keep pulling back for a little while whenever you bring it up.
No, that's fine. But, actually, like, this is something I think is important part of this, I guess, approach to religion and scripture and stuff that we're trying to promote, is that you can't actually talk about these things directly.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'm going to mention, since you were talking about categories, I'm just going to steal something that you said to me earlier today, that David took a census, and it's recorded in a couple different books. Probably one of those is a Chronicles, and one of them is a Kings.
Yeah, I think so.
Because
like, it might actually be recorded in all three. It might not be in Chronicles and Kings and Samuel.
Oh yeah, okay.
I don't remember.
So you said in one book it says God tempted David to take the census, and in another book it says the devil tempted David to take a census. And so there's this idea.
I don't know. I'll tack on a disclaimer. I don't know that that's exactly word for word.
Okay,
that's
good.
Off the top of my head paraphrase.
Yeah. But at any rate, we get this idea that taking a census is not entirely a good thing. And from the sort of perspective of the rationalist, and certainly of the totalitarian leader, then of course it's a good thing. Of course you want to categorize every single person.
Right. Yeah, which is like David's actual motivation. He wants to know, he wants to take account of the strength of Israel, so that he knows his capability to go to war.
Yeah.
So like that seems at first it's like, well, yeah, obviously, like Jesus tells the parable of the guy, you know, building a tower or whatever it is, and not taking account of his money, and then like not being able to get it finished, and you know he looks like a fool. You know, so obviously, you know, like you don't want to go into battle and, you know, not make the plans.
Right.
And not know what your strength is, and then just get defeated. Like, so obviously, what David was doing was good, right?
Now, but you also said that when they took the census, this is a different passage. Then they had to make some kind of like purification.
Well, so that was actually that's in the law in like Deuteronomy or something like that. I don't remember exactly where.
Yeah.
There's a law concerning like, so it's like it's not that David wasn't allowed to take a census. It's that
the law did allow for it.
Yeah, the law did allow it, but tacked on a requirement. Like, if you do this, if you take account of the men of Israel, every man in Israel has to give a ransom for his soul.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Right.
Like, make a sacrifice.
Right. And so, I mean, just to apply that to categories, it's like you said putting things into categories is useful. In the case of a census, it's useful. In the case of theology, it may be useful at times.
Yeah.
Certainly in the case of like how you conduct your life as a business person, or whatever, budgeting and all that. Like there's value. Actually, since I mentioned budgeting, I will say I don't budget at all. I never have, and I do very well with my money. But it's I just have this simple law that, like, if your expenses are less than your income, then you're good. And
yeah, right.
I mean, I never have had to worry about money, and I've never categorized anything.
Yeah.
But I spend less money than anybody that I know, so it's easy for me. But that's what it's like when you're when you want to be a hermit, I guess.
Yeah.
Anyways, categorizing things. And just rational approach to things, coming up with a rational system of things, can be really, really beneficial. But there's also a kind of cost that goes along with it, and you can do it. It is permitted in the law, but you also have to be aware of the cost that comes with it. And so you need to pay this ransom for your soul when you're doing it. And when you mentioned it, it made me think of like the way that people feel about social media or different aspects of internet culture, where everybody's collecting your personal data all the time. It's like there are systems out there and literal machines in this case that are putting you into categories. And you can do that, but it's also right of you to be resistant to it in some way. You can do it, you can be a part of it, but there's also, like, you need to find some way to kind of pay this ransom for your soul.
Yeah, so going back to the story of David, it's like that's what he doesn't do in Israel. Like, there's no ransom paid for the souls of the men of Israel for taking the census, and so God requires a ransom of them. He puts a curse on David and on Israel. And like, how is it? I can't remember if these details are exactly right. God gives David a choice. So it's like, okay, you've done this thing and violated the law and didn't pay the ransom. And like, also, like, there's also like an element like you're forgetting the lessons that God has taught you, that it's the strength of the Lord that delivers you from your enemies and not your own strength.
Mm-hmm.
But so you've taken this upon yourself, so now there's a price to pay. Either you can flee from your enemies for 3 days, or you can have a famine for such and such a period, or you can have a plague. Like, choose one. And I think he chose the plague. Is that right?
I don't know.
But it's like here, like, there's a consequence.
Yeah, right. So I think that's helpful to mention that, just because it does capture a lot of our perspective of categorizing, but of rational thought and rational systems. And maybe I could even use the word totalizing systems again. Yeah. Is like there actually is a kind of a place for that, but there are dangers. Yeah, there's a price too.
You have, like, you can't get around paying price.
Yeah, right.
And so, like, it kind of ends up like you're actually better off not doing it. Like, David and Israel would have been far better off had he just not taken the census.
Mm-hmm.
Although it's like you talk about, like, you understand that if you abide by these simple principles and these simple laws, that you don't have to take account for everything.
Yeah, right.
It's when you...
Well, that's what I said about budgeting. Like,
that's what I was referencing.
I have a law that is way simpler than budgeting.
Right.
And it's, to me, it's a very light burden. You know.
Right.
Again, the law is basically just don't spend money, but don't spend more than you're making.
Yeah, right.
And so, I don't intend to use this as an opportunity to brag about myself, but I make investments. So I prepare for the future, and. Yeah, in different ways. Again, I won't talk too much about the types of investments that I make, but it's not exactly that I'm just floating through this world.
Yeah.
But I have a law, and I adhere to it, and it is really easy to adhere to because it's so simple.
Yeah, and it's like you have all these. This is kind of an aside, but also still related, I guess. Like, you have, like, all these things in Christianity today, like these teachers on, like, being good stewards and budgeting, and watching over your finances and balancing them out and doing this and that and that. And it's like, it's really interesting to me to see this. Like, there's a very simple law which is essentially what you're presenting, which is don't spend money.
Yeah, right.
Like, this is a really simple law. Like, you don't need these things, guys. And like, budgeting becomes important, and these things become important, and retirement funds become important, and all these things become like not only important but absolutely necessary the further you extend yourself into the world. So it's like the more things that you have, the more you're tied to them. So
Yeah.
like, you have internet, you have television, you have a cell phone bill, you have a mortgage, you have a car payment, you have all of these things. Is something that ties you even further down, and so it becomes increasingly necessary to take account of your things, take account of your funds,
Right.
take account of yourself. So it's like these things actually are important if, like I said, the more you're extended out into the world. Like, you can't get by, like, you kind of can't get by without them. If you're if you're managing a Fortune 500 company, it's like you'd better have an account of all things,
Yeah, right.
or you're a bad manager.
Yeah.
But it's like, if you're, and like, I guess this will go back and like throw in this metaphor. It's like, the more you have upon yourself the mark of the world, like, the more it's necessary to do these things. It's like, the less you have that mark upon yourself, the more you have like this mark of God on yourself. It's like the rules become simpler, things become simpler, and I think that kind of relates to Christianity in general. Like, like, we've talked about the ecumenical councils and the history of the church and stuff like that in our private conversations quite a bit. And like, I make this comment, like, I have really mixed feelings about the ecumenical councils, because on the one hand, I don't think the things that they say are wrong, and I don't think that the things that they condemned are not in fact worthy of condemnation. But it's like, what you get through this process in like the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries in that era is like this increasingly more worked out definition of Christianity, which just like makes it harder and harder and harder to actually be a Christian.
Sometimes we make comments about how off topic we're getting, but I just want to pause for just a moment to make the comment, like, it is amazing how on topic we are right now.
Yeah, right.
Because again, this is going to be the discussion. By the time we get to the mark of the beast, we will have already had the discussion about it.
Yeah. Right.
So I'm just very pleased right now in the way it's going.
Yeah.
I did still want to make one comment,
which is just like a subtle way of suggesting to everybody, like, pay attention to what we're saying.
Yeah, right. No, actually, I'm taking. I like a good structure.
Right.
That maybe that is relevant to this also. But like, as a creative person, as like a storyteller or a songwriter or whatever, like, I really take a kind of delight in structure. And then in this conversation, I'm just seeing it unfold right now, and it's
right.
it's thrilling to me. I did want to make one more general comment about Revelation, and this again, I'll reach to my romantic poets for this one, but I did say the book of Revelation has been extremely important to a lot of people down through the years, and for basically every great romantic poet, the book of Revelation was one of the most important influences in their life and in their work, and that goes for Wordsworth, who is the premier of all of them, in my estimation, and in many other people's as well. He's like the definition of the whole movement, in its best form, I guess. Maybe I would add, but his biggest influence, what he aspired to be or to be better than, was Paradise Lost, and then like his number 2 influence was the book of Revelation. And then you have guys like Shelley, who was a atheist or agnostic, and yet he said he made Revelation his constant study.
Right.
And then you get like Blake was sort of in his own world when it came to religious beliefs. I mean, really fascinating character. But he said everything that I know came from the Bible. He also is a big fan of Paradise Lost, incidentally. There's obviously strong connections between Paradise Lost and the Book of Revelation. But Blake and his wife would sit naked in their garden and read Paradise Lost together. But anyways, I said he would.
Not that we're necessarily endorsing that behavior. No,
but it makes a strong point about this sort of prophetic literature in the character of Revelation. So he said everything that I know came from the Bible. And again, that's conservative Christians shouldn't get that excited about Blake. I mean, I guess in a way I'm conservative Christian and I'm excited about him, but like he's not endorsing your positions when he says that. But again, like premier among the books of the Bible, Revelation is like where it's really at for Blake as well. Again, just if you're in this sort of like quasi-mystical poetic tradition of the Romantic poets, then you love the book of Revelation. And these guys also are rejecting institutions. They're rejecting rational systems. The rational systems of the Enlightenment, the institutions of the church and the monarchy in France. I mean, these are English poets, but again, wherever there's a rational or totalizing system, they do not like it. And so any of these rational approaches or totalizing approaches to Revelation, they had no interest in them whatsoever. And without those systems, they looked at Revelation and they said, "This is awesome. What's happening in this book is amazing."
Yeah.
And like the greatest thing that I could accomplish in my life would be if I could do something like this.
Right. Yeah, and like for me, like you say, I'm not, I guess, looking to accomplish something on the scale of Revelations. For one thing, you can't. Like I say, Revelations is everything. Like I mean that as far as you can extend that idea. Like Revelations is everything.
Well, I mean, give a taste of that, because that's really where I would like to go with the conversation, but I have a different way of talking about it than you do, maybe.
It's like Revelations is a totality, like I mentioned earlier. Like, how would I say this? Revelations isn't, I guess, in my view, some new prophecy that's tacked on to the end of Scripture to tell us how it's going to happen when Jesus returns to judge the world. It's like, no, Revelations is actually like John receiving this vision that shows him how everything comes together. And it's like, I think Jesus actually gives you this clue repeatedly throughout the book of Revelations when he comes up and says, like, you know, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning of the end, and like the one that was and is yet to come. And it's like he's describing himself, and like this is the revelation of Jesus Christ. Like what John is seeing is the revelation of Jesus Christ, and like this is saying, like, this story, this revelation, this is the thing that, like Christ, who it is the revelation of, this was already, like, this has already happened, but it also is right now. Like, this is describing your current reality, and it's also describing something that's to come. Like, it's the complete story of all of history. It's the complete story of all of Scripture. It's the complete story of Christ. It's the complete story of the church. And it's like, it's also the complete story of your culture, or it's the complete story of me as an individual. Like, it's all of these things. And so it's like, this is kind of why I throw out this like charted out interpretation of Revelations, is because in that view of Revelation, it's none of those things.
Yeah.
So it's like you entirely lose the meaning of Revelations when you're trying to figure it out.
You know, like I said earlier about the, you mentioned the idea of a closed interpretation. And I said, if you have a closed interpretation, you're throwing out more truth than you're capturing. I still think those closed interpretations are capturing something that's true.
They're capturing something. But I'm not entirely sure what they're capturing sometimes.
Well, I mean, I specifically mentioned, like, if you interpret Revelation to be speaking about the Catholic Church and the papacy.
Right.
You know, like in the centuries or decades leading up to the Reformation, then okay, that works.
Right.
That is a good interpretation. That you can see the patterns in Revelation in the church at that time. So that is
Right.
a correct interpretation.
Yeah, but then when you limit yourself to merely that interpretation, like what you end up causing is something terrible and abominable and tyrannical.
Right, yeah.
It's just like, I guess, again, ties us back, like we say, this conversation keeps tying itself back to itself. Like, ties us back to this mark of the beast. It's like, when you totalize something like that, what you create is absolute tyranny.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what you create is something that is like, it seems like it's really good, and like it's built on something that's good, and it contains truth, and like you can't refute it at its face, because like, well, obviously there's truth here, but like it just ends up being a beast that devours the world.
Right. Yeah, I just kind of tie this to, I guess, like my philosophy of art, and symbol and art in particular. We try to interpret works of art, and we try to say this is the meaning of work of art. And when we do that, when we say this is what this symbol means, what we've done is we've cut off every possible meaning of that symbol except for one. And so the same thing I said about the closed category, the symbol now means less than it did before because you provided an interpretation of it. And that's something that has something to do with the spirit of your interpretation as well, because like your interpretation might have been great, but when you present that as the interpretation, then the great thing that you've captured winds up paling in comparison to the whole depth and breadth of what that symbol can be. So if you do that, you make that kind of interpretation, and then you start teaching that in a classroom, then all these kids have to sit through your English class, and they hear about this means this, and this means this, and this means this, and they think, I am not interested at all.
Right.
I hate literature. I mean,
right.
that is the response to, people might call it overanalyzing. And in a sense, it's not overanalyzing is kind of the right word. But like I said, your interpretation might have been perfect. It's not like you interpreted something that wasn't there, but you acted like your interpretation was the whole of reality and the whole of truth.
Yeah.
And it's not.
Right. Yeah, I mean, which gets back to something we've. I guess.
Since I made that, I also wanted to say, like, you're talking about this type of interpretation applied to the symbols in Revelation as being like the mark of the beast, and what you have is something awful when you do that type of interpretation. So that's why I mentioned the English classroom, where you have all these kids and they look at that kind of interpretation and they say, this has nothing to do with me.
Right.
People love stories. And when you put this mark of the beast upon stories, people will hate stories.
You're right. Yeah, and it's like people should love Christianity. Like, they really should. If you give them true Christianity, like, they're going to love it. It's not just that they should, like, they're going to. But when you put the mark of the beast on it, like, they're going to hate it. It becomes a monster, a monstrosity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's very perfectly said. I think that has been such a major theme in all of our conversations that we've had so far. Like, I mean, what's the problem with rational thought? What's the problem with categories and totalizing systems and all of that? And we say, well, actually, there is a place for those things. There is a place for categories, but when you close that system, then you've created a monster that people will hate. And our tendency in our world, not only in Christianity, but across the culture in every kind of a way, is to set up a category and to close it so that any truth that is outside of that box, you will attack it and destroy it. Like we're creating an awful world by doing that.
Yeah, and like I mentioned to you before, like I want to be more careful not to make it sound in things that I'm saying like that I'm attacking a viewpoint, or that I'm attacking a particular group of Christianity. And like, even when I mention things about evangelicals and fundamentalists, or maybe we say something about Catholicism or something like that, it's like I'm not trying to attack them. I'm not trying to ridicule them and so on and so forth. Like my motivation, I guess, is what we're getting at in this conversation is I'm against this kind of totalizing categorization.
You know, people always talk about this this image of like we want to wake people up.
Yeah.
And I feel like almost what we want to do is put people to sleep. Like again, like the rational thought, the light of reason is good.
Yeah.
But so is like the darkness of the dream.
Right.
And in a world where we've lost that, then we have nothing but these totalizing systems, and we have nothing but hatred for one another. And so, I mean, in a way, like when I say put people to sleep, I mean, I know that sounds like a weird thing to say, but I mean, there's like, that's a symbol with tons of meanings attached to it. One of them is cease from striving.
Yeah.
Like you're trying to fill every minute of your day with work. You're trying to fill like your whole brain with this sort of mental rational work, and you must sleep. You must cease from striving and just rest.
Right.
As God gave us the pattern, like you work and you rest. But also what I'm saying is again this sort of return to dreams. There is something precious and something deeply meaningful in the non-rational world of the dream. And again, if we lose that, then what we have becomes a beast.
Yeah. So like, are we ever actually going to talk about about the mark and the number of the beast?
Okay. Yeah. Go for it.
No, actually, I'm not ready quite to get there yet either. Yeah. So like, we've talked a little bit in our private conversations again about, like I mentioned, I've been reading Gregory Palamas, and I really like him. And this might be sounds strange to somebody who knows who he is. Like, why does this conservative, beachy Amish Mennonite boy like a 13th century Greek Byzantine theologian of the Orthodox Church? Like these things seem like they couldn't fit together.
Mm-hmm.
What I find fascinating to him. So he's dealing with the with scholasticism. Like you have theologians coming from the West. One in particular that has Greek background, but was raised in Italy. He's coming east to the Byzantine court and presenting this Western idea of scholasticism, which scholasticism is kind of what we're talking about. This idea that it had arisen in like the more elite schools in the West during the Middle Ages about developing systematic theologies.
Yeah, I was going to use that term because in the Protestant circles we don't talk about Protestant scholasticism, but we talk about systematic theology.
Yeah. It was like the main thrust of scholasticism is learning and study and university, and like the
Well, also, I mean, just the process of reasonable thought. I mean, like applying logic to theology, where
Right.
you have these are my basic fundamental axiomatic truths, and I got those from the Bible.
Right.
And maybe I got those from other sources, but like these are the principles that I can say these are true, and now when I start putting them together, I can come to conclusions and
Right,
build,
so it's
build
like
conclusions off of those things. I mean,
it's
that's
like a Pythagorean theology.
yeah, I mean, in a sense. But I mean, it's pure basic like fundamental logic, and logic is a good thing, I mean, like it's a good process.
Right.
But like you start building these little pieces together, and we're just, in order to do that, you've got to turn all of your basic axiomatic principles that you got from Scripture or from wherever else. You have to turn those into these closed box systems. You have to make them mean less than what they might have meant otherwise. And now you've turned them into objects, and now you can pile them together and you can build a great system out of them.
Yeah.
But it's like they were never objects to begin with. So the whole practice of logic, in a sense, is built on this idea of turning principles into objects, making them into one simple thing. And again, like, it's extremely useful. I definitely don't want to go on the record as like discouraging logical thinking.
No, and so like this goes back, like going back to Gregory Palamas, like his big thing is the transfiguration on Mount Tabor, and like pointing out to people, like, pay attention to what happened here, and to what Jesus says to Peter. So like, let's make sure I get the story straight. I think it's Jesus asked his disciples before they go up the mountain, who you say that I am, and they list off all these things that people say that they are. So it's like, Gregory says, like, look, this is an illustration of teaching, that here's what the teaching is concerning who you are. And then Peter finally pipes up and says, you're Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus' response to that is, flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you. Like, nobody taught you this.
Mm-hmm.
And then they go up the mountain of transfiguration, and they see him transfigured before them, and like illumined by the light of God, which is a really interesting story, because like it's a light, but it also casts a shadow. Like it's a light that envelops and obscures.
Yeah.
So like it seems to contain like contradictory natures. But and so like he's looking at this story and saying, like, look, what's going on here is that Peter's understanding is illuminated by the light of God, which is the Word, is Christ. That this is where you get understanding. This is where your intellect is informed from. But like before that, like, you actually have to subject your intellect to it. Like, you have to not put your trust in your institutions and in your faculties and in your rational abilities.
Mm-hmm.
Like your faculties of reason and logic.
Yeah.
It's like, these things are not sufficient to make you a theologian, to give you understanding of God, but only God himself is sufficient to give you that.
Yeah. You know, you can kind of make that argument, that same sort of critique. Well, I will say the critique of the limits of pure reason, and I use that phrase because that's the title of a Immanuel Kant book, The Limits of Pure Reason.
Yeah.
But
I wouldn't know that.
But you can make a very secular case for that as well, and it's a very ancient case, which is just like, you look at the field of rhetoric. Rhetoric is basically the art of persuasion. It's the process of bringing someone else into an understanding of the truth.
Right.
Now, you could define it in more manipulative ways as well. Rhetoric is how I get people to believe what I want them to believe. But we'll present it in the most positive possible light and say that's the art of bringing people into an understanding of the truth. And you have like these three pillars in rhetoric, the three rhetorical appeals, which are ethos, pathos, and logos. And logos, of course, we have this theological meaning of the word logos. The logos was made flesh. John talks about Christ as being the logos, but in rhetoric we can just simply translate that and say we're talking about logic. We're talking about the rational pattern of thinking. And if you can walk somebody through the rational pattern of thinking, that will help you to persuade them of your position, but that is insufficient according to the field of rhetoric. So not only do you need reason, but you have appeal to ethos, which is authority. Modern people don't like authority, but when it comes to rhetoric, we just kind of have to bite the bullet and say, yes, this is reality. You cannot persuade people unless you can persuade them that you are an authority, or that there is something authoritative about your message. The institution that you represent is an authority, whatever. But you are not going to persuade people to your position unless authority is on your side. And then the other is pathos, which we normally just translate as an appeal to emotion. Maybe you could come up with a loftier way of describing that and say, religious experience is not mere emotion, and that is a part of this persuasive of flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. Anyway, I just wanted to make the point, you can make the secular argument that says reason isn't going to get you to the truth, but you can also make like this, not only a secular argument, but like a very utilitarian kind of secular argument that says reason alone isn't going to get somebody there.
Right. Yeah, so like going back again to like tying this into our broader conversation, the broader pattern, I guess. Again, like, so we're kind of making the argument that logic and reason.
The Kant thing might have been called, or Kant thing might have been called critique of pure reason. I'm not sure. I might have the title a little bit wrong. So
yeah.
I did just want to make that quick comment. Go ahead.
Anyway, going back to like so we're talking about the mark of the beast here. Remember that. I'm reminding the audience.
Yeah, I know. But if I did make a mistake, I wanna
right.
acknowledge it.
Yeah. No. Like sort of the argument that we're presenting here is that this, I guess I would put it like the trust that you place in your logic or in your reason, or even in like, so let's say you're putting like total trust in the theology and the doctrines of your denomination as they've been given down to you, or your confession of faith that somebody 400 years ago wrote down and you've adopted as your personal belief system, as like being like a totality of your belief. And like all of these things, it's like, well, these are all of them the mark of the beast.
Yeah. You know, there's something really interesting in that process too, because that's a closed system that you have received.
Yeah.
It's a closed category, and the people who wrote it did not have that closed category.
Yeah, right. And so like that's interesting. Like I like that way of putting it. It's like maybe that's what you can define the mark of the beast as a closed category.
Yeah, there's this line which I really enjoy from Basho, who was a haiku poet from like feudal Japan, maybe a little bit later than that. But he said, "Do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the wise. Seek what they sought."
Right.
And he's describing that process. Like if you're following in somebody else's footsteps, then you have created a closed system, and you've said, I need to follow in this closed system and operate according to its principles. That is not what the masters that came before you were doing. We talked about that a couple days back also about if somebody's writing like some sort of mystical writing, some sort of treatise, or like an order of a monastery, then they're sort of writing, these are the principles, but you can't write down the actual process that you went through when you had your life-changing mystical experiences, because when you had that, you weren't reading a manual.
Yeah.
Like, so it's impossible to actually transmit it in writing or in speech, either one, because that is not the thing itself.
Right. So what the guys in the early church do when they're writing instructions for monks or monasteries, or giving spiritual guidance to other monasteries or something like that, is they tell a bunch of stories about monks that they know, which is like the way you have to do it.
Yeah.
It's like you can't, because like I like going through this process myself of writing, like, okay, I want to write this I guess you could say this treatise, or this work directed, I guess, at like my own church. Like imagine that I'm writing this as like an epistle to my own church, and like here's the things that need to be set in order. And so like thinking of like our particular Anabaptist, conservative, Amish, Mennonite sort of standards that we apply, and like our practices, and also thinking about like the areas in which, you know, like maybe we've lost something, or maybe we've drifted away from the center in some way or another. And you know, there's been a lot of attempts to do this throughout, I guess, fairly recent history, but they all end up being like these voluminous, rational explanations of our doctrines. That, I mean, they just like these huge books. And like, I'm not necessarily saying that what they said is wrong, but it's like there's something abhorrent about the way in which they lay things out and define them and categorize them. And it's like I find myself, if I'm writing something to accomplish the same goal that they set out to accomplish, like I feel like I can't lay these things out directly.
Yeah, right.
Like, instead, like I have to use like this huge circular pattern, like because like this is what I have to do is lay out like you mentioned this earlier, and this is like the central motif in my thinking is God says to Moses, like, make everything according to the pattern that I showed you in the mountain. Like he's talking about the pattern. So like God gave Moses in the mountain, he gave him the law, and he gave him the instructions on building the temple and the ornaments for the temple and the orders of the priesthood. And so like he's saying like what he says to Moses is like, this is a pattern. Now do everything according to this pattern. And this is brought out again in Hebrews, like concerning the church. And like extending that is like, look, what we're doing is here's this pattern. And like that's what we're doing in this conversation also is like, look, here's this pattern. And like we need to make everything fit in, like not fit into these categories. Like don't categorize things, but see how things belong in a pattern.
Yeah, you mentioned like telling stories is the way that you have to do it. One, a story captures a pattern,
right,
in a way that that an essay is very hard pressed to do. I won't say it's impossible, but it's difficult. Story is sort of like where you find meaning, and if you look at your own life and you try to figure out, is there meaning in my life, then you have to view your life as a story in order to even begin to approach the question. So like story is kind of ultimate importance. But when you're coming up with ideas, now this might be like sort of an esoteric thing to say, but you were saying you come up with ideas and you try to write them, you try to put them all into categories, and it makes sense to do that. Because if you can put things into neat categories, then what you're saying can be more easily understood. So there's great benefit in being able to do that. But there again, by putting things into categories, you're offering to your reader something different than the thing that was in your own mind,
right,
which didn't exist in categories. Like the ideas that were dawning upon you didn't fit into a neat system, and you're trying to impose that on it so you can pass it on to other people.
Yeah, and like this is something I've come to recognize, like in my own attempts to, I guess, relay my own beliefs or my own views, or like relay my understanding of the scripture, or however you want to put that, is that I lay these things out in this well-defined manner, in this systematic manner, and then when I get done, I listen to what people say, and it's like, well, that's like what they get is not what I have.
Yeah, but at the same time, even though that kind of demonstrates the sort of insufficiency of categories, it also demonstrates the necessity of them, because you can't communicate those we'll just say like flashes of inspiration. You can't communicate those at all unless you put them into categories. So back to like the census, like it fits in with the law that you can take the census, but there's also a problem with it. There's a sort of like spiritual truth that is broken by the census. That's broken by putting things into categories.
Yeah, I mean, there are also, like, obviously there are examples where people are put into categories in the scripture. So it's like you have the Jew and the Greek, male and female, like those are categories. The sheeps and the goats, those are categories. Those on the right and the left, those are categories. The foreigner, or like even like the tribes, like those are all categories. Like going back to the Old Testament.
Yeah, right. Well, but when you also have this kind of reminder of the importance that this closed category is insufficient.
Right.
I mean, for one thing, you started off with referencing a passage that says there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither male nor female.
Well, actually, that wasn't the one I was thinking of.
No?
I was actually thinking of the one, like, when he's talking about like this, the gospel's delivered to the Jew first and then to the Greek. That's actually the one I had in mind.
Yeah.
It's like, because like there's the one where the categories are clear, but then like you say, you take that further and then you have another passage that's like after the gospel is delivered to the Jew first and then the Greek, like you see the categories are overthrown.
Yeah, right. And in terms of like the categories between tribes, I mean, like you're going to marry across tribal lines. Like these lines they're rigid and they're blurry at the same time.
Yeah.
You have like the category of Jew and Gentile, which becomes like this sort of supreme category. But again, marriage to foreigners, it does exist. It has consequences, but it's not evil.
Yeah, and like we mentioned also in a previous conversation about the men of Nineveh, and where God says to Jonah concerning them, like they don't know the difference between their right and their left, and much cattle. And I presented like one way of looking at that is like these people that are totally confused and mixed up. But there's another way of looking at it. I think this is from Maximus the Confessor, who looks at it the opposite way and saying like, look, these people through repentance have overthrown categories, and like this has made them righteous in my sight.
Yeah.
That they've overthrown categories and have brought all things together into their proper place.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not sure if I agree with the interpretation, but it's still...
No, I'm not sure either, but like you say, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Like it's fascinating.
Right.
Because like it is actually, like the context of it is actually after the repentance.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, like I say, even if it doesn't capture what is meant by the images in the scripture, it still shows off a type of thinking.
Yeah, right. But and like there's a sense in which I think maybe you can argue it contains both meanings. That it's like on the one hand they're unrighteous because they've gotten things out of their proper place, but then on the other hand, like there's also righteousness in that they've taken the categories and put them all in their place, and then like in Christ or in God, like they bridge them, they span across them.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, I think we better get to the mark of the beast.
Yeah, right. We've been like talking for like an hour probably.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So what do you have to say about the mark of the beast, John? No, like, so we've been talking about the mark of the beast this whole time. That's our dirty little secret.
Yeah, right.
I guess like we need to tie that back in.
Well, now we did mention that we get ideas in maybe typically among conservative Christians that this is the mark of the beast, this thing that's in the real world, and it might be things like you said, microchips. Maybe you said credit cards. I don't remember all the examples that you gave. Like everything, vaccines was one that's, people have been mentioning that lately. It's something everybody is forced to do. Everybody is going to have this, but like whatever people come up with and say this is the mark of the beast, it's always some sort of totalizing system that's trying to classify everybody.
Yeah.
It's trying to put people into a system, and like I said, even a credit card does something like that. And actually, a credit card company theoretically has power to say, now I'm not presenting this as like a legitimate conspiracy, but a credit card company does have the power to say, I don't like your religion, therefore you cannot spend money.
Yeah.
So that type of classification, run amok, or if the power is in like truly evil hands, it could be used as this terrible tool for evil.
Yeah, and like there's an interesting thing about the mark of the beast is like it says concerning the mark of the beast, like first of all it says like the beast will cause that everyone receives the mark on their right hand and on their forehead. And like it doesn't say the beast will cause that his servants will receive it. It says everyone will receive this mark.
Yeah.
And then it also says like, and it'll be that you can't buy or sell unless you have the mark.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes you have this like extended to like the level of, you could say like almost to the level of conspiracy theory, where they're going to create this mark or this system or this technology to exclude Christians, to not allow us to do buy and sell unless we put the mark of the beast. But we can't put the mark of the beast on ourselves, because then we're going to hell. Like, this is kind of the impression I get a lot of times when people are looking at the mark of the beast.
Yeah.
But it's like, no, actually what it's saying is you can't function in the world unless you have something of the beast in you.
Right.
Which is actually true. And like this is I guess where I want to take it is, it says the mark of the beast is the mark of a man, and a lot of times, or the number of the beast is the number of a man rather, which it's unclear, I guess, in my mind, whether it's saying the mark and the number are the same thing, the mark, the name, and the number are the same thing, or if they're connected. Like I view it as like they're tied together and connected. And it says like the number is the number of a man. And like you might have this interpretation like, oh, that's meaning like there's going to be a specific man that's the beast, and he'll have this number 666 associated with him, or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, no, there's two ways you can look at that, and I think they're actually both true concurrently. Like they're both true at the same time. That it's the number of a man, which if you know something about Greek grammar, that's actually not, like, it's not presented with that indefinite article, because it doesn't exist in ancient Greek.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually saying it's the number of man, anthropos. So you can interpret that as like, is this saying this is the number, like this is the thing, this defines man? Or you can also look at it that, yeah, it is the number of a man, but that man is Adam. Like the beast has put his mark on Adam, which is like, this is entirely biblical to view it this way, because like there's so much else. Like go back to Hebrews, that Adam has his heart corrupted through his fall. Adam has put upon himself the mark of the beast, and like so by extension does all of Adam's race. Like all of Adam's race inherits this mark. Like this is I guess the way I look at it is like, he's saying the mark of the beast, the number of the beast, this is the number of a man, and that man is Adam, because Adam's sin is wanting to know everything, wanting to be able to have this complete and this perfect knowledge and accounting of things.
Mm-hmm.
This is what he was trying to do. He was trying to make himself like God,
yeah,
by eating of the apple.
And interestingly, he's naming animals beforehand. I mean, like he's coming
Right.
up with ways of classifying things, like even in the garden.
Yeah.
And so there's, you were saying that everyone has the mark of the beast on them. It's not just the unrighteous people, but everyone has that mark. And we can expand this closed interpretation of a symbol in a moment. But for right now, if we discuss that, we'll start with the idea that that this mark of the beast represents a sort of totalizing system.
Yeah.
As we mentioned before, which is what we've been talking about the whole time, these different totalizing systems, these ways of categorizing things, classifying things. Then we see there is something that's acceptable about classification, about putting everything in its proper place. Adam is, as I said, classifying things
Right.
In the garden, but then there's also this type of classification. I mean, maybe you could say the knowledge of good and evil. I mean, there's so many things that could mean, so I hate to pin that down too. But since we're speaking of classification, now that becomes like you're wanting knowledge of mysteries. What is good and what's evil? To go unbiblical, like Antigone says something like, which of us can say what the gods consider evil? We can't have knowledge of these mysteries.
Yeah. And like I also want to throw in there, like concerning that maybe you can say the man is Adam. Like, what does the name Adam actually mean? The name Adam actually means man.
Mm-hmm.
Like you could look at it as being basically the same word being used there. It's like this is the mark of Adam. This is the mark of a man. This is the mark. But like it's maybe presented in this way to make the point that this is something that you extend onto yourself. Like this is the mark of Adam, and by extension also you.
Carl also means man.
Interesting.
That's not very biblical, but I just think it's interesting that you would have a name that just means guy. Hey fella. But it, you know.
Incidentally, who's the great totalizing force in early medieval Europe?
Carl, huh?
Man the Big. Or the Great Man, Charlemagne.
Yeah.
Which literally means Carl the Great.
Yeah.
And again, Carl is man. So he's the great man.
Yeah.
Actually, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we might be stretching on that one a little bit. Now you mentioned Adam. There is a connection between the mark of the beast and the mark of Cain as well, like a symbolic connection. This is a mark that goes on your forehead. Cain received a mark that was on his forehead as well. And it's like a mark of protection for Cain, actually, like so people will not harm him, because he's asking God for protection. Like, people will want to kill me when they see me, and so he gets that thing that protects him. Now, is that mark associated with totalizing systems? It's hard to say. I mean, maybe that's a stretch to say so, but Cain's descendants go on to create everything that is a totalizing system.
Right, but like also, what's the point of a totalizing system? It's to protect you.
Yeah, right.
So like going back to your illustration of budgeting, it's like, well, it's a totalizing system that exists to protect you from poverty.
Mm-hmm, right.
And you know, like Jesus tells the parable of the guy who's had a great harvest, and so he builds a bigger barn to store all of his good. It's like, well, then your soul is going to be required of you this night. And it's like, there's a man that, you know, is accounting against his own famine, against his own mortality, and it's like, nope, you can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I'm true. Like, you know, and I think I say his descendants create the totalizing systems, but you know, like the city is kind of the premier of those. Of course, they also create agriculture, but so his descendants Cain's descendants go out and found cities, and cities, like, these are sort of this ultimate system, this ultimate mark of civilization and order, and there is something ruthless and dehumanizing about a city. There are things about your human nature that are not acceptable if you're going to live in a city. That some of those things aren't acceptable if you're going to live amongst other human beings. But there are also a lot of things that are perfectly fine if you're not in a city, if you're in the country.
Right.
But when you go into the city, you have to shed some of your humanity in order to be a part of it. So it strips something of your soul.
Right.
But it is also something that protects you. It is a mark of protection to be in the city.
And it's like you build, like in ancient times, like you build walls around the city to keep evil out. You know, that might be wild beasts like lions and things like that are roaming in the desert, or roaming bandits and things like that. You know, keeping the evil that exists outside from coming in and destroying you.
Yeah.
You know, like as far as, like, you know, saying there's also the mark of Cain, it's like, I really actually think the mark of Cain is just an extension of the mark of Adam.
Yeah.
Because, like, what I see in the story of Cain and Abel, it's like, okay, Adam has done this thing, this awful thing, you know, of taking the fruit and eating it, and, you know, wanting to make himself like God, and is punished for it, and is cast out of paradise, and receives mortality and death as his reward.
Mm-hmm.
But then he has his two sons, and one son takes Adam's folly and runs away with it, and that's Cain.
Yeah.
The other son learns Adam's lesson and accepts on himself the mark of God, and that's Abel. And of course, Cain kills Abel.
Yeah.
And then you have Seth, who's just kind of like the middle ground. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah.
Because it's like, here, obviously, like, we can't actually have a righteous man, or he'll just get killed.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's going to happen. which again is also the story of Jesus. Like, you can't have a righteous man or they'll kill him.
Yeah.
Um,
Which, I mean, I think like a part of the lesson, especially when you apply that to Jesus, is like, to be a righteous man, you must stand up in the face of death.
Right. Yeah, so it's like, in my mind, I guess, I don't know if that's a stretch or not, but like the mark of Cain, and like the mark of Cain is like a curse that God puts on Cain that is actually just an extension of the curse that he's already bearing through his father Adam. And it's like God is making more clear through Cain, like, look, this is the path you've chosen to go down. This is the consequence of what's happening. You're taking on like this cycle of evil. This is your mark. That this, like, your pride and hubris and desire, to be in control of all things, is going to create this world that just increasingly devours itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if we apply the logic of the census, the totalizing system of the census, and then we apply that to the city, which comes from Cain, then the lesson is that if you're going to live in the city, you have to pay a ransom for your soul.
Right.
Which, as a country boy and somebody who's, I mean, I've spent several years living in towns now, then I sort of feel that. Actually, I feel like this is maybe too much of a tangent, but I think we get all these sort of novel meditation practices that urban people really like and rural people think are just totally crazy.
Right.
And like, if you do this stuff, like you have some kind of spiritual problem. But I don't know. I mean, there is something about like being part of the system of the city that like it's pulling something out of your soul. And I think that urban people have some spiritual needs that rural people don't have.
Well, that's also interesting because it's like Christianity, on the one hand, largely takes roots in cities early in its history.
Mm-hmm.
It's not exactly clear if that's the case or not. Like, because obviously we don't actually have much historical record of what's going on in not the cities.
Yeah, but I mean, you have these, missions going to cities. Like,
right.
If Paul's traveling around, he's going to tell you what cities he's going to.
Yeah, but like one, like, understanding also, like, because the city is the center of agriculture, basically.
Yeah, right.
It's where you come together to do business, and so like, of course, that's where you're going to go. If you're a philosopher, if you're a religious teacher, you're going to go to a city because that's where everybody's coming to do business.
Yeah.
Which is, again, like the mark of the beast. You can't do business without the mark of the beast.
Right. Yeah, including in this case this sort of business of God.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. But then, so like, what happens? Like, a really interesting thing happens, and this relates to what you're talking about, giving a ransom for your soul. When you have the Edict of Toleration, like the two edicts, I forget what the first one was, in 314, and then the Edict of Toleration. These are both by Constantine, I think, in 317, that makes Christianity legal and ends all persecution, all formal persecution by the Roman government. What ends up happening is a lot of Christians flee society.
Mm-hmm.
They flee the cities.
Yeah.
And this is where, like, basically the root of monasticism, that's not entirely accurate. The idea of monasticism existed well before then. But, like the Desert Fathers and the Cappadocian Fathers and people like that, like, these are all people that flee the cities. And like, I think it relates to that idea, like you're talking about, like, you've got to give a ransom for your soul.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like them recognizing as like, well, I can't give a ransom for my soul in the city anymore.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's this interesting tension between like the church and the empire that runs throughout all of Christian history. Like there's a problem with the church being married to the totalizing force of society.
Yeah, and like the fact that it's the empire, I think, is particularly important. Mm-hmm. And like, it's always the empire. Like, throughout the entire history of the church, it's always the empire.
Yeah.
So like, it's the Roman Empire, and then it's the Eastern Roman Empire, and then it's the Holy Roman Empire and Charlemagne, and then it's the Russian Empire, and then the church in Rome sets itself up as like its own empire. So like it's always the empire.
Yeah.
And like that's fascinating because what is an empire? It's a totalizing system.
Yeah, right.
Like that's like the simplest definition of an empire.
Yeah, America fancies itself very much as not being an empire, and yet we can't quite escape that.
Right.
That criticism that we are an empire.
Right. Well, according to that definition, we certainly are.
Yeah, right.
And there again, like you have this bizarre thing.
And
Christianity,
like, we are more of a totalizing force than any of the empires in history.
Yeah, and like you have this bizarre thing in American Christianity. It's like America is the empire that we serve. Like America has become this holy state, this holy empire.
Yeah. And again, I mean, there's great tension in that statement.
Yeah.
I mean, even for somebody who says, who buys into that and says, yes, America is the empire. We are serving America. We're trying to do the best for America that we can do.
Yeah, and make America into this godly institution.
Yeah, right. Even somebody who has that position also feels a tension within himself that, like, I'm not saying that America's golden, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because those that hold that position would hold that the predecessors before them who did precisely the same thing with Rome are an abomination to the church.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I mean, in a way, it's
in a
it's
way they're
true,
right.
like, and it's true of them too. That's what I mean. Like, there's this tension. Like, there must be some connection between the church and the empire, which I mentioned before. And that's not a particularly Mennonite thing to say, because the Mennonites have been so far removed, like the Desert Fathers or the Cappadocian Fathers, like these early monastics. The Mennonites have always pulled away from the state and pushed for this idea of separation of church and state. That we don't want to be any part of that. But there's still a tension in that. Like, you want your king to be serving God, or your president. You want the ministers of the state to be aligned with the will of God in the work that they do, and not sons of the devil.
Right, and like there's also like this implication throughout Scripture that like when people of God are in the midst of the kingdom, ultimately the king can't help himself but serve God. Like you have this with Nebuchadnezzar and the Egyptians and the Persians. Like they can't help but honor God.
Yeah.
And ultimately Rome.
Yeah, it's interesting that, I mean, the leaders of a nation seem like they're people of such great power, and yet they are, like more than anyone else, they are swayed by the spirit of the times, like the social forces around them. They're an extension of that. This will be an extreme version of that statement, but you could extend that to say that the heart of the king is shaped by the heart of the people.
Right. It's like even the Mongol Khans bowed themselves to the church, which is like an interesting little fact of history that most people don't know. But it's like here you have like the most tyrannical, like what we present as like the most tyrannical empire possible. But it's like even them, it's like even they submit themselves to the church.
Yeah. You know, there's this, I can't quote this, but it seems like this is a passage in Ecclesiastes that's talking about how everyone is serving someone else, and it kind of like goes up the hierarchy of society, and then says even the king eats from the fields.
Right.
Like the king, and that's sort of a weird way to cap it off, because he's not like the servant of his peasants in a way, like a good king is. But like by the natural, just simple definition of what a hierarchy is, the king is the guy that's the top dog, and everybody else is doing his will. But in this strange way, he's doing the will of the people. Like his spirit, his will is strangely subordinated to the will of the people.
Yeah. Anyway, like as far as like going back to the mark of the beast and the number of the beast, I don't know how much we actually want to get into the number itself and numerology and all those things.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, there are a lot of different interpretations, and I mean, a lot of them seem like very appealing.
Yeah, I mean, so like there's like some interesting things, like so like the number 6 is 1 plus 2 plus 3, which you can define as unity. 1 obviously is unity, duality.
Well,
is
it's
2.
a triangular number too, which
Yeah,
is like it is a pattern. The number 6 constitutes a pattern.
Yeah, but it's like also like you have like this unity and duality and multiplicity, which is like the desire to contain the essence of everything.
Yeah.
And so like it's often said like number 6 is the number of a man in the Bible. And then like you get like 6 times 6 is 36, and then if you add all of the numbers from 1 to 36 together, their sum is 666. I don't know quite what that implies, but it's a pretty interesting fact.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it is.
But it's like there's kind of this perhaps this implication in the number 666, which is also why like early church fathers are aware of the fact that some documents of the book of Revelations list the number as 616, but they say that's an improper reading, and here's why. Because it doesn't really mean anything. The number doesn't mean anything.
Right.
So like those are all some interesting things you can throw in there, but it's like maybe there's an implication embedded in the number of this totalizing force, this tying of everything together, this like tyrannical perfection. You can think of like fascism as being like the perfect expression of this idea, which incidentally, like I'd say on this, is like this is the reason why the fascists and the Nazis and Hitler disturb us so much, is not because they're so unspeakably bad, but it's because they're the most human thing that we've seen in, like, they're the most human thing that you can see.
Yeah.
It's like this is this ultimate, what you see in fascism is the ultimate humanity. Like this ultimate tyranny of perfection.
We mentioned in a recent talk that if you actually descend into chaos, the world's not going to be destroyed in chaos. What's going to happen instead is that from chaos or from anarchy, some totalizing system is going to rise up.
Yeah.
If you have a nation that descends into anarchy, then immediately it turns into this sort of absolute tyranny.
Right, which is exactly like 1930s Germany.
Yeah. No, it is, yeah. But I mentioned that just because that you sort of also have that symbol in Revelation in the description of the beast who comes out of the abyss. Like he comes from this place of chaos, and then immediately he sits on a throne.
Right.
The dragon gives him the throne. So if this idea of the totalizing force is correct,
well, is it accurate to define the dragon as a being of chaos?
Well, no. It says that he rises. There's
Yeah, I know.
one beast rises up out of the sea, which is also chaos.
Right.
One rises up out of the abyss, which is chaos.
Right.
So now, I mean, a dragon is often a symbol of chaos as well, but I was not trying to make that.
No,
that
I didn't
claim
think
right
you
there.
were. I was just interjecting that as my own.
Yeah, right.
It's like chaos, like when the beast arises, chaos gives it its throne.
Right.
It's like it yields to it. Chaos will yield to the beast.
Yeah.
Like chaos will yield to tyranny.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I thought that was kind of an interesting connection to that point that we'd made earlier. But I want to try to poke at this idea of totalizing force a little bit because there's really not very much said about the mark of the beast or the number of the beast. There's just very, very few words in Revelation that refer to it. And so we've been kicking around this idea of this mark as the totalizing force.
About the mark of God than there is about the mark of beast.
Right. So like I said, I wanted to poke at the idea a little bit because in reading through the passage again, I sort of felt like this makes sense. This kind of interpretation of it, it doesn't seem like it's contradicted anywhere in the story or in the symbols in the story. to say that the number of the beast means that you're classifying people and you're putting them into a kind of totalizing system. It sort of all makes sense, but it also seems like the text doesn't say that.
Right.
And not only does it not say it directly, literally, but even the symbolism is pretty light.
Yeah, and so like, well, that's important to bring out, because like I've made this comment on Revelations before, that like if Revelations was trying to say the things that you think it's saying, it would have said that.
Mm-hmm, right.
Like the reason Revelations is written in the way that it is because that's the most perfect possible way to express what it's expressing.
Yeah.
Like, so like if you think you have to decode it, it's like, no, you're wrong. Like, it's not a secret code that's expressing something that you're only going to get if you crack the code. It's expressing what it can express in the most possible way, or the best possible way. So it's like,
yeah,
saying that you're I lost my train of thought.
Sorry. For those listening, I just pointed him down a little trail that we haven't been down before, so I distracted him. I knocked him off the trail. I literally pointed him off the trail he was on.
Yeah.
No, you were saying Revelation expresses it in the best way that it can be expressed.
Yeah, so like tying that together with what you're saying about like the totalizing force is like, that's obviously an insufficient explanation.
Mm-hmm.
Because if that's all it meant, it would have said that.
Yeah, right.
But I think at the same time, that's obviously contained in what it does say.
Yeah.
But there's more to it than that.
Right.
Just as in the sense, like I was thinking, you could look at it the other way. What's the mark of God that you wear on your forehead? Well, you could say that it's humility, but that's obviously an insufficient explanation too.
Yeah.
Like the best explanation for it is it's the mark of God.
Yeah, right.
And like that's a mystery that unfolds, like it constantly unfolds. Just like the mark of the beast is a mystery that unfolds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is this interesting like undoing of, you might say it's an undoing of the mark of the beast. You might say it's an undoing of the mark of Cain, or you could stretch back to the Adam. When you receive that, not only do you receive the mark of God on your forehead, but you also receive a new name.
Right.
So like this sort of total undoing of all these things, like your name is your identity, and your, like it's also a means of classification. Like you've been put into one system and identified as one thing, and now you will be drawn out of that system and identified as a different thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now earlier I raised that objection. Since you didn't give me the same answer this time around, then I'll just go through it. I'd said that I didn't know if the symbolism was really there to be able to say the mark of the beast is about a totalizing system, and that's how we would define it. And you said, well, pride is a part of it as well.
Yeah.
And pride just goes hand in hand with the idea of a totalizing system. Obviously, being proud is not the same thing, but like being proud in your knowledge means that you think that you can create we'll say a systematic theology that can contain everything.
Right.
Being proud in your power means that you can be a totalitarian dictator of a great nation. Like you can make everything in the world conform to your will. Like that's what pride.
Right.
That's what pride is all about. So pride is the thing that creates totalizing systems.
Yeah, and I guess where I try to get at with this idea of the mark of the beast is, so like let's stop looking at things as being the mark of the beast and see how it's, I guess you could say, this sort of philosophical idea, and it's one that unfolds and unwraps, and we've been presenting this, I guess, this kind of framework for interpreting the idea and for allowing it to unfold, but like it's a lot more than what we've said.
Mm-hmm.
And like we can't possibly say what it actually is.
Yeah.
And like consider the beast as being like the devil, basically. and like consider like, so what is the mark of the devil?
Yeah, which again, like, is in Revelation.
Right. Just as like the mark of God is something you can't pin down to being one thing, but it's like an overarching thing that unfolds and contains so much. It's like, well, the mark of the devil is the same way. It's something that contains a lot. It unfolds, it unwraps, and I guess my goal is like to try to present, like I said, present this way of allowing that to happen, creating an understanding, I guess, in my own mind and minds of those listening. Like, okay, how can we start to look at this idea of the mark of the beast, see it unwrap, see it unfold, and equip me to meditate on this idea and to consider this idea and what it means to have the mark of the beast
Well,
stamped on me.
Since you mentioned that connection with the beast and Satan, then I'll also just mention a couple other things there. One, again, I guess trying to, in a way, justify this idea of totalizing system, and maybe tie some of these things together. Christianity has often associated rationality with the devil, and it's kind of a curious thing, especially for modern people. And it's not, again, this idea that we should reject logic, we should reject reason or whatever. Like, Christianity was not saying that in making the devil into a rational figure, but essentially it's pinning pride on the devil. And that's what this sort of devilish rationality is all about, is this pride that says you can contain everything, you can contain it all in your system of rational thought. And so, like, that's sort of another connection, this Satan, which is the beast.
Well, it's like, even I take it even further than that. It's like what Satan is telling, what the serpent, the devil, Satan is telling Adam is, you can be like God. Which is maybe another way you can categorize, or not categorize, define this idea of the mark of the beast, is like this mark that you have stamped on your heart, that I can in fact be like God. And this expresses itself in all kinds of subtle different ways. And it's like being this mark of pride and presumption that is in constant conflict with the mark of God that's on your heart. The mark, like, no, I can't be like God. I need to humble myself and instead, be in subjection to God. Which again is like also the same thing as this idea that the church is in constant conflict with the empire, and with this idea of the empire being stamped on the church. It's exactly the same conflict.
I was thinking of this notion of budgeting again, and like just sticking this in with the idea of pride, because budgeting is like such a benign totalizing system.
Right.
And even though I said like that is not the way that I approach it, I still think like, well, it's a good thing, and it would be good if more people in this world would budget more wisely.
Right.
So I'm not attacking it at all, and that's the reason why I like using it as an example, is because you have something that's clearly good and useful and beneficial and like saves people's lives.
Right.
Sometimes when they do it, but in a budget you also have this sort of pride, and again, like this sort of very benign kind of pride, but it's sort of like, if I can manage all the pieces well, then everything will turn out well in the end. And you get this idea by contrast in the Bible that like you shouldn't even say we will go into this city or that city, but you should say if the Lord wills it, then we will go into this, then we will be able to carry out our plans. And so a budget, like you sort of created this plan, you created this map for things, and it's good. I mean, it's good to make plans to go into this city or that city, like to have some direction in your life. So not to criticize the idea of making plans either, but to say there is a danger in it. There is a kind of pride that goes along with it. And I guess basically just return to this idea, like pay a ransom for your soul when you're doing this. Like I'm I've been going through the process of trying to lay out plans for my semester of teaching. And last year I started, I took the job the day before classes started. And this is high school classes, and I got to like plan every day the night before, basically. Like I was just scrambling. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but I was scrambling the whole year. I thought my life would be way better if I had a plan, if I had only had time to come up with a plan before this started. And so lately I've been coming up with a plan for next year. And when I go through it, like there's something that feels good about nailing everything down and having a clear roadmap, but there's also another part of me that says, that wisely says, you can't trust this plan. Because when you put it into motion, things will change, and they better change, or else you're a totalitarian. Like,
Right.
like you had better respond. I mean, I've got some things I'd like to try that I've never tried before, and it would be very arrogant of me to believe that those things will succeed.
Yeah.
And I think they will, and I hope that they will. And like my vision is I think a very good vision.
Well, that's like,
But I don't know. I mean, like
that,
I must go into it with humility.
yeah, it's like you can actually take that idea in a tyrannical direction too. Is like, well, your solution to the fact that your plans might not work is to make more plans to plan on them not working.
Yeah, right.
It's like,
Well,
you can just create this.
Then you're just killing yourself.
Right, but like people do that.
Yeah, right.
And I would say a lot of like, I've never been a teacher, but I had a lot of teachers. It's like I can think of a lot of teachers that's the way they operate.
Yeah.
Is just like contingency plans on top of their plans.
Yeah, right.
And like their classroom has to be conducted in perfect order, because we can't get off the plan, because then what are we gonna do?
Mhm. Yeah, and yet if you don't have a healthy amount of that tyrannical system, then
Right.
then you have a disastrous class.
Right. Although I would say the guy I consider to have been my best and favorite teacher had a fairly chaotic classroom.
Yeah, right.
But then again, like, I think it's probably a situation that wasn't good for a lot of students.
No, it wouldn't be. I mean, I too tend to prefer a degree of chaos.
Yeah.
In things, and there are consequences. I mean, like it's a challenge to find that right balance between how much do you nail everything down and how much do you keep things open, because there are consequences either way.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess we've been going for a while. We probably ought to wrap up.
Yeah, we're like over an hour and a half, I think.
Yeah. Oh, I'm getting assaulted by mosquitoes.
Yeah. Well, any other thoughts? I mean, we talked about this mark of the beast. I mean, I just ask, is there anything else that we've left out that you think we need to consider?
I was going to say maybe we should resist the temptation to totalize our conversation.
Yeah, right.
No, I mean, like, I guess nothing more really comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we've laid out a pretty good framework.
Yeah.
But like also like taking this as like we said with Revelations, like Revelations is something that expands to the whole of reality, to the whole of your experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Carl Jung also really liked Revelation.
Yeah.
And he said he absolutely believed this to be a vision of John.
Right.
He believed it was this spontaneous vision that came on this man because you might say like the Christ or the God of the New Testament was too much love.
Right. Or at least to John he was.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And there was something you could say like incomplete, something naive, like John's again for Jung, John's his take on things was good, but it had some holes in it.
Right.
And those holes were big and glaring, and they needed to be dealt with. And so then he has this spontaneous vision of Christ the judge that comes in, and it's a terrifying judge.
Yeah.
And
like,
John, when he beholds Christ, like he falls on the floor as if he's died.
Which is like maybe the reason why modern Christianity gets so obsessed with Revelations, is because like the Christ of Revelations is the opposite of the Christ of modern
Yeah,
Christianity.
right. Mm-hmm.
Like, you read the description, like, I love that, like, I love the Christ of Revelations, like, not because I'm like some kind of sadist or something like that, but because like this is a complete Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Right.
he is a terrifying judge, but at the same time, like, it's clear that he's doing all of this for the love of his bride.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I mean, there's beauty and glory in the Christ of Revelation also.
Yeah, and it's like what you get in Revelations, which is like Revelations, like the Christ of Revelations is the basis for the iconography of Christ in the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the reason for that is because they see the Christ of Revelations as a complete Christ.
Yeah.
Like, this is the thing that contains all of the nature of Christ.
Right. Yeah, and so in the Carl Jung's perspective on it, then Revelation is I'm trying to describe how it's designed, like, almost it's like, but not that John is doing the designing. Maybe a Jungian way to say it would be that, like, John's subconscious designed this thing. Maybe you could also say, like, this vision is some sort of corrective that comes from God.
Right.
But like, however you try to define it, like, the design of this thing, the purpose of this thing is to give a complete picture for someone who has an incomplete picture. Mm-hmm. And I mean, your take on it is, like, that is what this book is. Right. It is the complete picture.
Yeah, exactly. And like, it's interesting, like, considering the like the context of John's revelation. It's like he's in exile all alone on the island of death.
I paused briefly. I normally don't do that, but we had some noisy vehicles driving by, so I apologize for the interruption, but that was the reason for it. And Dave, you were saying?
Yeah, I was saying the context of John's revelation is he's on the island of Patmos, which is the island of death. It's like a desolate place, and you're sent there to die. He doesn't die, miraculously, but so he's there by himself in isolation with nobody else around in this terrible place. All he has to do is meditate. So this is what he's doing when he receives this revelation. So, like, he's not coming to this vision or this knowledge by like sitting around with all of the other apostles and all of the disciples and all of the other Christians and exploring theology and, like, trying to figure out. So it's like, okay, so how do we put our faith together? How do we conclude this thing? How do we wrap all the loose ends up? Or, like, how do we develop these perfect statements of faith? It's like John's perfect statement of faith is given to him in the form of this vision of Revelations. Mm-hmm. So, like, this isn't through a rational process that John receives this perfection of understanding.
Yeah, right.
But it's through it's through the Spirit. It's through the spiritual process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Again, if you wanna kind of catch our full perspective of the Mark of the Beast, then rewind and listen to it over again. Because, again, even before we really got into the subject, we were dealing with what does a totalizing system look like? Where do we see that in our world? How is it an evil thing, and yet how is it the thing that is necessary and is a mark of every single man? Something that we do engage in, and yet something that has consequences for it, which I think is really a valuable perspective, actually, because when we complain about the things in modern society that everybody is doing, we are saying we're doing those things too. And yeah. I don't mean me and Dave. I mean when everybody complains about things in modern society and says this is a problem and this is a problem and everybody does this and everybody does this. Well, you're doing it too, and you have to.
Right.
I mean, most things, anyways. I guess there are some things that you can get away from, but for the most part, like, you do kind of sell your soul to systems
right,
that you don't like.
I think it's important to point out. So, like, you have the whore of Babylon, the woman, like, in Revelations, that's judged, but, like, those that judge her, they're not the righteous. It's not that, like, the righteous. So you have this idea that the righteous are called out from her so that they won't take part in her judgment. Like, they won't be partakers of her judgment, I should say. Mm-hmm. They don't receive a portion of her judgment for being in her when this judgment comes on her. But the important thing there is who are the ones that are actually doing the judgment, who are the actual forces bringing, like, I guess you could say, the wrath of God down upon her. They're actually, like it says, they're the 10 heads of the beast, or the 10 horns of the beast. I can't remember. Like they're those that are a part of the beast, servants of the beast. Like it describes them as kings of the world that don't have power, but will be given a power for an hour to accomplish this. So it's like they're not the people that do the judging and bring God's wrath and purify His church. They're not good people. They're not righteous people. Like, they're the unrighteous. And like, this is a consistent theme in Scripture, that the instruments of God's wrath and judgment are the unrighteous.
Yeah.
So it's like, be cautious when you think that you're purifying the church.
Yeah, or I mean, any institutions. Like, we have this tendency to judge the institutions and talk about how evil they are. And yeah, it is the wicked that are judging those things. And the good, the righteous people do see, yes, these are institutions, and I don't want to sell my soul to the institution.
Right.
But yet, my duty, like the story of my life, oftentimes winds up being a part of some institution.
Yeah, and like that's
as a part of that institution, like, I'm redeeming the thing.
Yeah, like that's the thing. Like, part of the story too is like they don't separate themselves off from the woman. They don't bring themselves out of Babylon. They don't reject Babylon. Rather, when the time of judgment comes, God Himself lifts them out.
Yeah.
And then like they're also like the ones presiding over, like, what I would describe as her baptism and resurrection and renewal in Christ.
Yeah, although that to justify that, I think, would have to be a different conversation than this one.
Yeah.
But yeah, our relationship with systems and with institutions is complex. And I mean, that's like our relationship with the mark of the beast is sort of complex as well. Like it's
yeah, but it's like, you don't want to be the revolutionary, or I'll go ahead and take the risk of saying, you don't want to be the reformer.
Yeah. Yeah, not the kind of reformer that breaks away and forms a new church.
Right. Or like the Marxist revolutionary who wants to totally topple and overthrow the system. Because like, well, look what happens when you do that. What happens is the book of Revelations is fulfilled. You're given power for an hour, and then you're destroyed. Like, the very thing that you create just consumes you. Like, the fires that you've created consume you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a true pattern. I mean, like, you're speaking about a symbol in Revelation. You're saying that symbol is fulfilled in these moments like this, and you can look through history and you can find examples of that revolution that consumes the revolutionary, and you basically can't find counterexamples. I mean, like, maybe simplistically we could point to the American Revolution as being a counterexample of that, but like, for the most part, where you do have the revolutionary who judges the whore of Babylon that he's coming out of, things don't end well.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. And see you next time. I don't know, maybe we'll talk about the whore of Babylon, but we might have other places we'll want to go to. Thank you for listening. If you would like to support this podcast, then all that we ask is for you to subscribe, think of a friend who might enjoy it, and share it with them. And please join us again for another walk in the woods, another conversation, and another journey in the sacred life.